guy literally looks at me square in the face and sits back in this love seat and says, "What are you going to do to me?"
Before the lawsuits, before the interviews, before the headlines, there was one question that followed Clayton Howard everywhere once he decided to speak. Why didn't you defend Cassie Ventura? It's a question that sounds simple on the surface, but becomes far more complicated the closer you look. Clayton Howard wasn't a bodyguard. He wasn't a friend stepping into a domestic dispute. By his own account, he was an escort, invited into private spaces where power, money, and fear controlled the room. Howard says he witnessed moments that stayed with him, moments he didn't act on, moments that would later define public opinion of him just as much as his allegations.
She said, she said something to him. I can't really recall what she said, but I recall what he did. He threw his hand out with a jab like the measurer and just turned over his hip and punched her square in the chest. She flew across the room.
What viewers often miss is what that silence represented. According to Clayton, the environment wasn't one where intervention felt possible. Sean Diddy Combs wasn't just another man in the room. He was a figure surrounded by security, influence, and an unspoken understanding that consequences followed disobedience. Clayton describes fear not as panic, but paralysis. The kind that convinces you that moving could make everything worse, not just for you, but for everyone involved. This is where the story begins to split in two. On one side, Cassie Ventura, a woman later publicly recognized as a victim of long-term abuse. On the other, Clayton Howard, a man now accused of doing nothing while claiming he was trapped inside the same system. In his interview, Clayton doesn't deny his inaction. He explains it, and that explanation forces an uncomfortable question. What does responsibility look like when power removes choice? Fear doesn't always look like running away. Sometimes it looks like standing still. And this matters because Clayton's silence then is directly connected to why he's speaking now. The interview isn't just about accusations. It's about reckoning, about explaining the moments he couldn't undo and the ones he refuses to stay silent about any longer. Stories like this are never easy to hear, and they're never clean. They exist in gray spaces where victims, witnesses, and perpetrators don't always fit neatly into one category. That's why Cold Case Chronicles doesn't rush to judgment. We document, analyze, and let the audience think. If stories like this matter to you, support the work by subscribing, engaging in the comments, and staying with us as this case unfolds. Silence is often mistaken for agreement, but in environments shaped by power, silence can be something else entirely. After Clayton Howard acknowledged that he witnessed abuse and didn't intervene, public reaction was swift and unforgiving. Many asked the same question again, louder this time. If you saw it, why stay? The answer Clayton gives isn't clean, and it isn't comfortable. He describes a world where control was subtle but absolute. According to him, nothing in those spaces happened by accident. Who entered, who stayed, who spoke, and who didn't were all influenced by one central figure. Fear, he says, didn't come from threats spoken aloud, but from understanding exactly who held power in the room.
So just off instinct, being a 225 huge black guy, I said, "What the fuck is you doing hitting this girl, man?" And I kind of like stood up to get at him. Vlad, I swear, I learned in this encounter that men exhibit power in more than physicality. It can be an aura, it can be a force, and Diddy got it. This guy literally looks at me square in the face and sits back in this love seat and says, "What are you going to do to me?"
Clayton says intervening didn't feel heroic. It felt dangerous. Not just physically, but financially and psychologically. He was replaceable, disposable, and he believed that stepping out of line could mean retaliation, blacklisting, or worse. In that moment, self-preservation overpowered morality. That doesn't erase responsibility, but it complicates it. This is where the story shifts. Clayton doesn't present himself as a savior who failed. He presents himself as someone caught inside the same system, one where proximity to power feels like protection until it doesn't. But his silence during those moments doesn't mean he views Cassie only as a victim. In his interview, Clayton draws a line between what he witnessed and what he claims personally harmed him. He acknowledges Cassie's abuse by Diddy, while simultaneously alleging that she played an active role in situations that caused him damage. This distinction is crucial. Clayton's lawsuit isn't an attempt to rewrite Cassie's past. It's an attempt to assert his own. He argues that two things can be true at once. Someone can be abused and still cause harm to others within the same environment. That idea unsettles people because it disrupts the comfort of clear villains and clear victims. And yet, that discomfort is exactly where the truth often lives. Clayton's story forces a difficult reckoning with how systems of power operate, how fear spreads, how silence is enforced, and how accountability becomes fragmented when influence shields some and exposes others. This isn't about excusing inaction. It's about understanding the conditions that produce it. At Cold Case Chronicles, we don't ask you to take sides, we ask you to pay attention. If you value careful analysis over outrage, support the channel by subscribing, sharing your thoughts in the comments, and staying with us as this story continues to unfold. By the time Clayton Howard decided to speak publicly, the narrative around Cassie Ventura had already solidified in the public mind. She was widely seen as a victim, someone who endured years of abuse at the hands of a powerful man. Clayton does not dispute that history, but his decision to sue Cassie, rather than publicly defend her, is where his story becomes most controversial. Clayton says his lawsuit is not about rewriting Cassie's suffering. It's about separating what he witnessed from what he claims happened to him. In the interview, Clayton explains that while he believes Cassie was abused by Diddy, he does not believe she was powerless in every situation. According to him, there were moments where she exercised agency, making decisions that directly affected others in the room, including him. That distinction is the foundation of his civil case. Clayton alleges that Cassie participated in arranging encounters, encouraged unprotected sex, and played an active role in an environment that ultimately caused him harm. These claims are not criminal findings. They are allegations, contested and unresolved, but they explain why his legal action names her. What Clayton resists most strongly is the idea that defending Cassie publicly would mean erasing his own experience. In his words, silence once protected the powerful. He doesn't want his voice now to protect anyone at the expense of his truth. This is where public opinion fractures. Some viewers believe Clayton is wrong, that suing Cassie unfairly targets someone already harmed. Others argue that accountability doesn't disappear simply because someone is also a victim. Clayton himself seems aware of this tension. He doesn't ask to be believed without question. He asks to be heard without dismissal. Civil lawsuits aren't about criminal guilt. They're about liability and damages. Clayton's case seeks recognition of harm, physical, emotional, and financial, that he says he carried alone for years. In that context, suing Cassie is not, in his view, an act of betrayal. It's an assertion that harm can move in more than one direction inside a system built on power imbalance. This chapter of the story isn't about choosing sides. It's about confronting an uncomfortable reality. People inside abusive systems can occupy multiple roles at once: victim, participant, witness, and contributor. At Cold Case Chronicles, we follow the facts as they're presented, not as they're convenient. If stories that challenge easy conclusions matter to you, support the channel by subscribing, joining the discussion in the comments, and staying with us as the final pieces come together. By the time Clayton Howard's civil lawsuit reached public attention, the legal context surrounding both Diddy and Cassie had already shaped public perception. Sean "Diddy" Combs had faced criminal scrutiny, culminating in convictions on certain counts related to transporting individuals for sex. Cassie Ventura, meanwhile, had not faced criminal charges. That distinction would play a central role in Clayton's approach. Clayton explains that the criminal system focused almost entirely on Diddy. While evidence of abuse and coercion was presented, the prosecutor's case did not extend to Cassie. Clayton says he recognized that the courts were not designed to address every nuance, especially in cases entangled with wealth and influence. This is where the civil system comes into play. Unlike criminal proceedings, civil cases allow plaintiffs to seek monetary damages for harm done, rather than criminal punishment. Clayton's decision to include Cassie in the civil case reflects his desire for accountability for his own alleged harm, not to criminally charge her. In his interview, Clayton emphasizes that the civil lawsuit is about personal restitution. He alleges that some of the choices Cassie made, whether knowingly or unknowingly, contributed to the environment that caused him trauma. This is the line he draws between acknowledging her abuse and asserting his own claims. What makes this chapter of the story compelling is the imbalance of power inside and outside the courtroom. Diddy's high-profile criminal case dominated headlines, shaping the public's sense of guilt and innocence. Meanwhile, Cassie remained largely in the shadows, and Clayton's voice became one of the few telling a more nuanced version of events. By framing his lawsuit this way, Clayton forces viewers to confront difficult questions. How do legal systems handle situations involving multiple people with varying degrees of agency? How do victims and witnesses navigate accountability when the stakes are high and the consequences unpredictable? This chapter is a reminder that legal outcomes don't always align with the full reality experienced by those involved. Sometimes, the law addresses only part of the story, leaving other truths to be documented and explored through interviews, testimony, and careful analysis. At Cold Case Chronicles, we focus on those complexities, bringing the nuances of the story to light. If you're following this case and want to see every layer explored, subscribe to the channel, share your perspective in the comments, and stay engaged as the story unfolds. Every story leaves questions behind. Clayton Howard's story is no different. It is a story about fear, power, and the impossible positions that people find themselves in when influence overshadows morality. His civil lawsuit against Cassie Ventura, set against the backdrop of Sean Diddy Combs' criminal case, forces us to ask, how do we assign responsibility when multiple people are both victims and participants? When silence, survival, and fear dictate choices, how do we judge actions or inaction? Clayton emphasizes that his story is not about hatred or revenge. It is about being heard. He says that even when people are caught in systems that feel uncontrollable, their experiences matter. Allegations of harm, he argues, should be recognized, even if they involve someone already seen as a victim. This chapter is also a reminder of how complex the legal system can be. Criminal cases address certain actions, civil cases allow personal redress, but neither can fully capture the nuances of human experience. Clayton's decision to sue, rather than publicly defend Cassie, is emblematic of that complexity. It's a method to seek accountability while navigating a system that cannot address every facet of a story. Ultimately, Clayton's story is a mirror. It reflects the difficult truths about power and influence in celebrity culture, the moral dilemmas faced by those with less power, and the long shadow of silence when fear dominates decision-making. It challenges us to think about accountability beyond easy labels of victim and perpetrator. At Cold Case Chronicles, we explore the layers that mainstream headlines often miss. Stories like this are uncomfortable, sometimes painful, but they are worth telling. They remind us that truth exists in shades of gray, and that understanding requires patience, empathy, and attention to detail. If you found this story compelling, make sure to subscribe to Cold Case Chronicles, like the video, and share your perspective in the comments. Engage with the conversation because stories only remain buried when no one listens.